Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a consultation specialist with SNC Lavalin. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics as our project moves into the assessment phase of the provincial environmental assessment process. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. So let's get started. Today, we are going to talk about the federal impact assessment process in order to help community members better understand the thinking behind and activities associated with the process. So, the federal impact assessment process. Before we dive into that, what I would like to do is give you a bit of a background on the Northern Road Link project. If we can move to the next slide, please. And the project is a proposed all-season road that's in northwestern Ontario on Treaty 9 land. The project will connect the Ring of Fire mineral deposits to the all-season highway network via the proposed Martin Falls Community Access Road. In addition, the project will provide an opportunity for Webequie First Nation to connect to the all-season highway network through the Webequie Supply Road. This project is subject to the Provincial Environmental Assessment Act and the Federal Impact Assessment Act, although we do not know yet whether a full impact assessment will be conducted yet, but we will find out very shortly. The two proponents of the project are Martin Falls First Nation and Webequie First Nation. Both communities are remote Indigenous communities about 500 kilometers north of Thunder Bay, and they are not currently accessible by all-season roads. So they use winter roads to transport materials and supplies on the ground for a very narrow window of time. Basically, it varies in length. And outside of that season, everything has to be brought in by air. There have been a number of historical studies on an all-season road to the Ring of Fire. In 2020, Ontario, Martin Falls First Nation, and Webequie First Nation announced an agreement to work together towards development of an all-season road. And this was signified by the communities agreeing to conduct an environmental assessment for the project that is funded by the province. So in terms of interaction with other projects, I think it's important to understand that there are currently 3 proposed all-season road projects in the region. Each of those is undergoing separate environmental assessments. Each started at a different time. Each started based on different reasons. NRL will conduct the Ring of Fire, will connect the Ring of Fire to the all-season highway network via the Martin Falls Community Access Road, and the NRL will connect the proposed Webequie Supply Road to the Martin Falls Community Access Road, thus allowing Webequie community members to ultimately connect to the all-season highway network, the Ontario Provincial Highway Network. And the project itself will enable economic activity by allowing for the transport of goods, services, and resources. In terms of the components of the project, again, this is an all-season, multi-use gravel road. Now we have, you may see on the screen here that the length, the estimated length is between 117 and 164 kilometers. The reason why we don't have a finite length is because we have road alternatives, and I'll get into that in a minute. So there's a range of distances it could take depending on which alternatives are chosen. Approximately 100 there will be an approximately 100-meter right-of-way for the road with a cleared area of 60 meters. In terms of water crossings, there will be numerous water crossings, using culverts and bridges as the structures, but there will be one large bridge crossing the Attawapiskat River. This crossing is over 200 meters wide. And then, of course, with all road projects, one thing a lot of people don't realize is that it's more than just that 2-lane gravel road. So there's a need for storage and laydown areas during construction. And then those are temporary. Then you would have maintenance facilities and maintenance yards. These would be permanent. There are access roads involved, and these are both temporary and permanent. Temporary for access to pits and quarries, some of which are temporary, some of which are permanent. The permanent ones would be used to supply and maintain the road over its lifespan of typically 75 years is the planning time frame or window that's typically used. There will be aggregate sites. So pits and quarries. Quarries are where bedrock is mined and then crushed and processed into material such as gravel that's small enough to use as construction material for the road. And then, of course, construction camps as well. So in terms of, I mentioned earlier, alternative corridors and how the road could vary in length between 117 kilometers and 164 kilometers. And it really just depends on which segments are chosen as part of the final preferred alternative. Right now we have 12 alternative corridor segments, and you can see them on the map on your screen right now. The corridor, when we talk about a corridor, what we're talking about is an area that's 2 kilometers wide, within which the final route will be identified and positioned. So that 2 kilometer corridor gives the project team an area within which it's the community members and the general public have identified that this is a preferred route through the consultation process. But within that corridor, there may be reasons to shift around the actual road position based on lots of different things, whether it's information that's collected from indigenous communities or particular environmental constraints or things that might restrict where the road could go. Lots of different reasons. Because we have these 12 alternative corridor segments, there's a lot of combinations of potential corridor routes. And I guess the one thing to note here on this slide is that I mentioned here A1 versus A2 is dependent on the chosen corridor for the Martin Falls Community Access Road. So the Martin Falls Community Access Road process will determine when and or where and how it will connect into the community, and then based on that, the Northern Road Link alternatives will be identified or refined further. So continuing on with alternative corridors, these are identified again based on terrain, but it also considers known biological or and indigenous knowledge constraints. Many of the segments that we showed earlier follow the esker, which is sort of a raised landform, typically composed of gravel or finer material. And then there's peatlands surrounding these eskers. Additional corridors were developed to accommodate all different potential crossings of the Attawapiskat River, and these additional corridors or these additional crossing locations were based on constraints that were generally based on constraints identified by community members, whether it's moose hunting areas or areas, sturgeon spawning areas, or other indigenous related constraints or reasons for not, for not running the road through. In terms of the Ontario process, the provincial process, this process requires a very in-depth assessment of alternatives, and includes consideration of net effects. Well, net effects, they're the leftover effects after applying what you call mitigation measures. Mitigation measures are measures to reduce or eliminate impacts. So whatever's left over is called residual or net effects. Criteria have been and are currently continuing to be developed, that will assess the advantages and disadvantages of the different routes. And we have an example here on the screen where we're showing red as less suitable, green as more suitable, and we're talking about, you see in the table here, looking at different soil types, so organic soils versus non-organic soils. And the next slide just shows the alternate Attawapiskat River crossings. There's the West Bridge option A, West Bridge option B, and then an East Bridge crossing. So now we'll move to talk about the impact assessment process, which is the federal process. So there's 5 main phases in this process, and I'll get into detail about each one. The first is the planning phase, which is where we currently are. Then that's followed by the impact statement phase, followed by the impact assessment phase. And then we have decision-making phase, and then the post-decision making phase. So after a decision has been made by the federal government on the impact assessment, post-decision would be things like monitoring and meeting other commitments. So we'll get into that in a minute. So that's sort of an overview of the phases of the impact assessment process. Let's now look at phase 1. Phase 1 is the planning phase, and the IAC description of the planning phase is the public and Indigenous peoples are invited to provide information and contribute to planning the assessment. So in this phase, which is a phase that we are currently in, there's an initial project description where it's sort of a higher level description of the project with some anticipated impacts and mitigation measures. And then after that, and this is where we are now, for our project, we have just submitted the detailed project description, which is a much more obviously detailed version of a project description. It takes the initial project description or IPD a big step further to provide a lot more details so that the Federal Impact Assessment Agency of Canada staff can then look at it and provide and determine whether an impact assessment is required. So right now we have submitted the detailed project description to the Federal Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and then they will then determine whether an impact assessment is required. And if it is required, then what is called the Tailored Impact Statement Guidelines, or TISG, are prepared and then issued. So let's move now to phase 2, the impact statement. Again, the IAC description of the impact statement. The proponent is provided with clear requirements for the information and studies for an impact statement. Sound science and Indigenous knowledge inform the impact statement. So, the proponent collects information and conducts the studies as per the Tailored Impact Statement Guidelines. So the Tailored Impact Statement Guidelines basically are the work plan provided by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. That's provided to the project team, and they then conduct the studies. And in the process of after conducting the studies, and doing an impact assessment, the proponent develops what's called an impact statement. That information contains information and studies outlined and requested as part of the tailored impact statement guidelines. In this same phase, the agency compares the impact statement submitted by the proponent with the tailored impact statement guidelines, the work plan that the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada has provided to the proponent, to see if it satisfies the requirements, to see if the project team is doing what IAC, or the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, has asked them to do. Let's move now to phase 3. So phase 3 is the impact assessment phase. The IAC description of phase 3 is as follows. The assessment considers potential environmental, health, social, and economic impacts of proposed projects, including benefits. Potential impacts on Aboriginal and treaty rights are also assessed and consulted on. The agency, meaning IAC, Impact Assessment Agency Canada, or a review panel, uses the information to develop what's called an impact assessment report. So IAC develops this draft and final version, both draft and final versions of the impact assessment report, as well as a consultation report. And then the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada develops recommended potential conditions of approval. So for example, if they were to approve the project, they would say, we approve this project, however, the following conditions must be met. And then these recommendations go to the minister. So that's phase 3, impact assessment. Then we move to phase 4. Phase 4 is the decision-making phase, and IAC describes this phase in this manner. Public interest is at the center of decisions. The impact assessment report and Crown consultation outcomes informs the minister or governor or council decision on whether a project's adverse impacts are in the public interest. If yes, the minister must establish conditions for the proponent. So if yes, that means the impact assessment the project has been essentially approved, but then they must establish conditions associated with that approval. What has to be done, typically on an ongoing basis, to ensure that there is nothing, there are no impacts beyond what have already been identified. Decision statements set out the rationale for the decision, providing, and with the purpose of providing full transparency and accountability. So making sure that this process is open and clear to the public and Indigenous peoples. So before making the decision maker must be satisfied that the Crown duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples has been actually fulfilled. That's a key part of this. And once that determination has been made, the minister can issue what's called the decision statement to the proponent, in this case Martin Falls and Webequie First Nations, with the reasons for the determination and the conditions associated with the approval. Let's look now at phase 5, post-decision. And this is an important phase, I think, and one that I think needs to be noted, because I don't think it's well known about this, even on the provincial side of the environmental assessment phase. So phase 5, post-decision. The official IAC description is the agency will be active in verifying compliance with decision statements and correcting non-compliance. So verifying whether the conditions are being complied with, and if they are not being complied with, making sure that corrections are made to make sure that there is compliance. So whatever the conditions might be, and they many different factors. And in the words of IAC, there will be greater transparency around follow-up programs with increased access to key documentation, as well as increased opportunities for Indigenous and community participation in follow-up and monitoring programs. So the idea is to involve the communities more on, significantly on the monitoring and compliance side. So the proponent is responsible for developing and carrying out the follow-up and monitoring programs. That's up to the proponents. That's up to Martin Falls and Webequie. Now, IAC may establish a monitoring committee to make sure that the science that's being conducted as part of the monitoring is sound science. And it provides, the idea would be to provide confidence to the public and Indigenous communities that the monitoring work is being done professionally and 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 properly. The IAC will track and report on the follow-up and monitoring programs and will make this available publicly. The IAC is responsible for verifying this compliance with the decision statement and actually undertaking the compliance and enforcement measures where they have to. And where there is not compliance, where the proponents are not meeting their commitments or not following the rules, IAC will work with the proponent to return that to compliance. So we'll now move to the big picture, I like to call it. So in this picture, we're seeing all three processes. There's the Webequie and Martin Falls internal review process. They do their own assessment of the project in their own way. There's the federal environmental assessment process, which I've been talking about. There's the provincial environmental assessment process. Now, there are some similarities and some differences between the federal impact assessment and provincial environmental assessment processes, and I'm going to get into those briefly next. So if we can move to the next slide, there we are. Okay, so I talked about the Tailored Impact Statement Guidelines. The Tailored Impact Statement Guidelines are the work plan for the impact assessment. But unlike in the provincial process, these are prescribed essentially by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. In the provincial process, the proponent prepares what's called the terms of reference, which is essentially the work plan for the environmental assessment, and then that is reviewed by the general public, Indigenous communities, and by MECP, the Provincial Environmental Agency in Ontario. Now, when we look at the EAIA assessment, the EA process, the proponent prepares the environmental assessment report, including their assessment for review by MECP. But in the IA process, the proponent prepares an impact statement. IAC reviews this impact statement and prepares an impact assessment report. Next slide, please. So that's a lot of information, I realize that. But I want to make sure I summarize this with you so that you can see everything we're talking about here, and make sure you see the difference between the provincial process and the federal process. So there are 5 phases in the federal process: planning, impact statement, impact assessment, decision making, and post-decision. Consultation with Indigenous communities and the general public occurs throughout the entire process. It occurs continuously. The proponent provides a detailed description of the project to IAC. Remember, I mentioned the initial project description followed by the detailed project description. IAC then reviews these and makes a decision as to whether an impact assessment is required. IAC issues the roadmap or work plan for the IA, which are known as the Tailored Impact Statement Guidelines. proponent prepares the impact statement. IAC reviews the impact statement and prepares what's called the impact assessment report for the minister, who then issues a decision statement. If the project is approved with conditions, the proponent then conducts all the follow-up and monitoring activities with IAC, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, making sure that they are complying, that they are following the rules associated with the conditions of approval. So I hope that's clear for everyone. There's a lot of information there, and I know it's a lot to take in a short period of time, but this presentation will be made available on the website for you to reference at a later date. And by all means, please feel free to contact us. If we can switch to the next slide, you'll see how you can contact us through. You can call, leave a message, you can email us, you can go to our website, northernroadlink.ca. So there's lots of different ways to get in contact with us, and we really encourage you to do that. We welcome input from community members and the general public. So that wraps up today's overview of the federal impact assessment process. We hope this was helpful and encourages you to join us again very soon. And don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information that you see on your screen and that I just mentioned. And you can get other contact information on our website, northernroadlink.ca. And we welcome you to speak with us about this project. We would love to visit your community at any point in time, and or meet you in whatever, or consult with you in whatever way is most appropriate for you, or most comfortable for you. We will comply with your consultation protocols. Please just send us your protocols, and we will do our best and see if we can connect with you as soon as we can to talk further about the project and get your input. So, miigwech, and we will talk to you again very soon. Look out for updates on social media and on our website. Miigwech, take care.